But you didn't expect to see me down here, did you? Yeah, firstly, sorry, I forgot to unmute myself. Secondly, let's turn that down a wee bit. Oh, hey, Tsubaki. Tsubaki is another bun. They're a good bun. They're a cute bun. You should follow Tsubaki. Also, that seemed oddly quiet. Let me just, There we go. Why am I not surprised that you were playing Library of Ruina? Or honestly, anything related to Lobotomy Corporation. But yes, Tsubaki is a friend of mine. I don't get to interact with them too much due to schedule. They're from I mostly know them from the community of another streamer called iLulu. You should also check out because they are an adorable puppy meme. Thank you very much for the follow, Tsubaki. Glad to see you around. That music is still loud. Still turning that down. Also, ignore the fact that there's train tracks in the background. There's also a train available in Lo-Fi Spirit City now, and I forgot to change the sounds. Oops. Anyways. I will be, normally I'm obviously a gaming channel, but occasionally I read as well. Seeing as I have... Today I only worked from 2 o'clock to 11 o'clock, which isn't that bad. That worked 8 hours, not 9. Okay, I worked 3 o'clock to 11 o'clock, which isn't that bad. It's just full 8 hours. But the rest of the week, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, I'm working 11 to 11. I'm working fucking 12-hour shifts starting at 11 in the morning. So, rather than long gaming streams, we're going to do some shorter reading streams. Each day, I'll be reading a handful of stories from some horror authors of renown. I don't have any particular stories chosen, so it's possible that one may be a little too long than the others and may eat up all or most of the stream. We'll see how that goes. But hopefully we'll still be able to go for a solid 1, maybe 2 hours. Much shorter than my normal 4 or 5, etc., but still a decent enough stream. And I'm going to try to use copyright-free music so that these all end up on YouTube later once Twitch is done with the bot. As some of you may have noticed, either from my promotional post, or from the Twitter post, or perhaps even from the title of the stream, I will also be doing tarot readings. It's been a long while since I've broken out my tarot cards, and it's not something I actively practice, so forgive me for being a bit slow and for whipping out the manual here and there. I have the deck right beside me on a TV tray, although I need to shuffle it. We will be doing simple 3-card draw. Recent past, the present, the future. Usually near future, but it's a little more sketchy. I really don't want to bother learning anything more advanced, like the fucking pyramid or star or whatever. And that's aside from the fact that I'm not terribly familiar with the minor arcana to begin with, all the more reason to use the manual, but I digress. For long-time viewers of the stream, I have it set up so that this is a point redeem. Costs about 5k points. I don't recall how long that actually takes to get, but I have a lot of long-time viewers who never use points. And for any more recent viewers, you can also just give me a $5 donation, or you could give me 500 bits, or you could just gift someone a sub. Because that costs you about $5. I don't get $5 from that, but equivalent exchange. It's fine. In the event that you redeem that in the middle of a reading, or, well, yeah, if you redeem that in the middle of a reading, literally, this big fucking book right here, then I'll do it at the end of the given story. Now, I have several books by horror authors, but I can't find most of them right now because I didn't really have time to look today. But what I do have is this big, chunky, fuck off H.P. Lovecraft, The Complete Fiction. So we'll be starting with Howard Phillips. Thank you very much. This thing is fucking hefty. And in fact, let's see if I can, out of my own sheer curiosity, let me see if I can find how much this weighs out of Amazon. H.P. Lovecraft, The Complete Fiction. Because I'm not breaking out a fucking scale for this. Can't find it initially on Amazon, but Barnes & Noble has it. For $27, it's 10% off. Apparently it is a Barnes & Noble's exclusive, which might explain why I can't find it on Amazon. Print language. Allegedly, it only weighs 1 pound, but this thing is definitely bigger than a pound. In which case, I'll see if I can weigh this thing later, but not tonight because I'm already dawdling it up. First order of business, let's go ahead and kill the music. Then I'm just going to take care of someone who just popped up in chat real quick. You didn't see them, but I saw them. I see everything. See you doing a little naughty. You fucking bot, get the fuck out of here. Reported, and blocked, and banned. I don't know why you can't ban someone from your channel if you block them. But, or at least using the thing that allows you to do that. Anywho. Let's just go ahead and crack open this big fucking thing. Let me go ahead and turn the sounds down a little bit too. There's some soft vinyl, some rain and thunder, and a fireplace nearby. Okay. Right. Let's see. Do you have an appendix or an index I can use? Yes, you do. You have 2 pages and then some worth of story. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30. So 30, 60... And then some stuff after the appendix for some reason. So let's roll a number between 1 and 60. 2! Ain't that a high fucking roll. Oh, I believe this is that one. Oh yes, this is a favorite of many. The Alchemist. And fortunately, one of the shorter ones, too. Let me go ahead and pull up the atmospheric background music. Let me just post that in the chat real quick. See how loud is that in comparison? Turn that down just a little bit, but that should be fine otherwise. Alright. The Alchemist. The Alchemist was written in 1908, presumably prior to Lovecraft's abrupt withdrawal from high school in June. I'm not sure. I assumed that was going to be a word aside from school. Like high society. It betrays the influence of Poe and earlier writers of Gothic fiction and its use of a European setting, the anonymity of the protagonist's family, the Comtes de, and the idea of a familial curse that endures for centuries. Poe's influence can also be felt in a first-person narrator's obsessive interest with his own psychological state. Lovecraft puts the theme of alchemy to much better use in a short novel, The Case of Charles Dexter Ward. It was first published in the United Amateur, November 1916. Which was published in the United Amateur, The Alchemist or The Case of Charles Dexter Ward. Also, while I don't mind a recommendation, I kind of find it offensive that you would recommend a different story in the information about this story. Does anyone else find that rude? Like, hey, you go and read a different book. Thanks. Who asked you? High up, crowning the grassy summit of a swelling mound, whose sides are wooded near the base with the gnarled trees of a primeval forest, stands the old chateau of my ancestors. For centuries, its lofty battlements have frowned down upon the wild and rugged countryside about, serving as a home and stronghold for the proud house whose honored line is older even than the moss-grown castle walls. These ancient turrets, stained by the storms of generations and crumbling under the slow yet mighty pressure of time, formed in the ages of feudalism one of the most dreaded and formidable fortresses in all France. From its machicolated parapets, forgive me if I don't recognize every word off the top of my head, and formidable fortresses, no. From its machicolated parapets and mounted battlements, barons, counts, and even kings have been defied, yet never had its spacious halls resounded to the footsteps of the invader. But since those glorious years, all has changed. A poverty but little above the level of dire want, together with a pride of name that forbids its alleviation by the pursuits of commercial life, have prevented the scions of our line from maintaining their estates in pristine splendor. And the falling stones of the walls, the overgrown vegetation in the parks, the dry and dusty moat, the ill-paved courtyards and toppling towers without, as well as the sagging floors, the worm-eaten wainscots, the faded tapestries within, all tell a gloomy tale of fallen grandeur. As the ages passed, first one and then another of the four great turrets were left to ruin, until at last but a single tower housed the sadly reduced descendants of the once mighty lords of the estate. It was in one of the vast and gloomy chambers of this remaining tower that I, Antoine, last of the unhappy and accursed Comtes de C, first saw the light of day 90 long years ago. Within these walls, and amongst the dark and shadowy forests, the wild ravines and grottos of the hillsides below, were spent the first years of my troubled life. My parents I never knew. My father had been killed at the age of 32, a month before I was born, by the fall of a stone somehow dislodged from one of the deserted parapets of the castle. And my mother having died at my birth, my care and education developed solely upon one remaining servitor, an old and trusted man of considerable intelligence, whose name I remember as Pierre. I was an only child, and the lack of companionship which this fact entailed upon me was augmented by strange care exercised by my aged guardian, and excluding me from the society of the peasant children whose abodes were scattered here and there upon the plains that surrounded the base of the hill. At the time, Pierre said that this restriction was imposed upon me because my noble birth placed me above association with such plebeian company. Now I know that its real object was to keep from my ears the idle tales of the dread curse upon our line, that were nightly told and magnified by the simple tenantry as they conversed in hushed accounts in the glow of their cottage hearths. Thus isolated and thrown upon my own resources, I spent the hours of my childhood in poring over the ancient tomes that filled the shadow-haunted library of the chateau, and in roaming without aim or purpose through the perpetual dusk of the spectral wood that clothes the side of the hill near its foot. It was perhaps an effect of such surroundings that my mind early acquired a shade of melancholy. Those studies and pursuits which partake of the dark and occult nature most strongly claimed my attention. Of my own race I was permitted to learn singularly little, yet what small knowledge of it I was to gain seemed to depress me much. Perhaps it was at first only the manifest reluctance of my old preceptor to discuss with me my paternal ancestry that gave rise to the terror which I ever felt at a mention of my great house. Yet as I grew out of childhood, I was able to piece together disconnected fragments of discourse let slip from the unwilling tongue which had begun to falter in approaching senility. That had a sort of relation to a certain circumstance which I had always deemed strange, but which now became dimly terrible. The circumstance to which I allude is the early age at which old comtes of my line had met their end. Whilst I had hitherto considered this but a natural attribute of a family of short-lived men, I afterward pondered long upon those premature deaths, and began to connect with them the wanderings of the old men, who often spoke of a curse which for centuries had prevented the lives of the holders of my title from exceeding the span of 32 years. Upon my 21st birthday, the aged Pierre gave to me a family document, which he said had for many generations been handed down from father to son, and continued by each possessor. Its contents were of the most startling nature, and its perusal confirmed the gravest of my apprehensions. At this time, my belief in the supernatural was firm and deep-seated, else I should have dismissed with scorn the incredible narrative unfolding before my eyes. The paper carried me back to the days of the 13th century, when the old castle in which I sat had been a feared and impregnable fortress. It told of a certain ancient man who had once dwelt on our estates, a person of no small accomplishments, though little above the rank of peasant. By name, Michael, usually designated by the surname of Mauvais, the Evil, on account of his sinister reputation. He had studied beyond the custom of his kind, seeking such things as the Philosopher's Stone or the elixir of eternal life. It has reputed wise in the terrible secrets of black magic and alchemy. Michael Mauvais had one son named Charles, a youth as proficient as himself in the hidden arts, and who had therefore been called Le Sorcier, or the Wizard. This pair, shunned by all honest folk, were suspected of the most hideous practices. Old Michael was said to have burnt his wife alive as a sacrifice to the devil, and the unaccountable disappearances of many small peasant children were laid at the dreaded door of these two. Yet, through the dark natures of the father and son ran one redeeming ray of humanity. The evil old man loved his offspring with fierce intensity, whilst the youth had for his parent a more than filial affection. One night the castle on the hill was thrown into the wildest confusion by the vanishment of young Godfrey, son to Henry the Comte. A searching party, headed by the frantic father, invaded the cottage of the sorcerers, and there came upon old Michael Mauvais, busy over a huge and violently boiling cauldron. Without certain cause, and the ungoverned madness of fury and despair, the Comte laid hands on the aged wizard, and ere he released his murderous hold, his victim was no more. Meanwhile, joyful servants were proclaiming the finding of young Godfrey in a distant and unused chamber of the great edifice, telling too late that poor Michael had been killed in vain. As the Comte and his associates turned away from the lowly abode of the alchemists, the form of Charles Le Sorcier appeared through the trees. The excited chatter of the menials standing about told him what had occurred, yet he seemed at first unmoved at his father's fate. Then, slowly advancing to meet the Comte, he pronounced in dull, yet terrible accents the curse that ever afterward haunted the House of C. May ne'er a noble of thy murderous line survive to reach a greater age than thine, spake he, when, suddenly leaping backwards into the black wood, he drew from his tunic a phial of colorless liquid, which he threw into the face of his father's slayer as he disappeared behind the inky curtain of the night. The Comte died without utterance, and was buried the next day, but little more than 32 years from the hour of his birth. No trace of the assassin could be found. The relentless bands of peasants scoured the neighboring woods and the meadow laid around the hill. Thus, time and the want of a reminder dulled the memory of the curse in the minds of the late Comte's family, so that when Godfrey, innocent cause of the whole tragedy and now bearing the title, was killed by an arrow whilst hunting, at the age of 32, there were no thoughts save those of grief at his demise. But when years afterward, the next young Comte, Robert by name, was found dead in a nearby field, from no apparent cause, the peasants told in whispers that their seigneur had but lately passed his 32nd birthday, when surprised by early death. Louis, son to Robert, was found drowned in a moat at the same fateful age, and thus down through the centuries ran the ominous chronicle. Henry's, Robert's, Antoine's, and Armand's snatched from happy and virtuous lives when little below the age of their unfortunate ancestor at his murder. That I had left at most but 11 years of further existence was made certain to me by the words which I read. My life, previously held at small value, now became dear to me each day, as I delved deeper and deeper into the mysteries of the hidden world of black magic. Isolated as I was, modern science had produced no impression upon me, and I labored as in the Middle Ages, as rapt as been old Michael and young Charles themselves in the acquisition of demoniacal and alchemic learning. Yet, read as I might, in no manner could I account for the strange curse upon my line. In unusually rational moments, I would even go far as to seek a natural explanation, attributing the early deaths of my ancestors to the sinister Charles Le Sorcier and his ancestors. Yet, having found upon careful inquiry that there were no known descendants of the Alchemist, I would fall back to occult studies and once more endeavor to find a spell that would release my house from its terrible burden. Upon one thing I was absolutely resolved. I should never wed. For since no other branches of my family were in existence, I might thus end the curse for myself. As I drew near the age of 30, old Pierre was called to the land beyond. Alone, I buried him beneath the stones of the courthouse about which he had loved to wander in life. Thus I was left to ponder on myself as the only human creature within the great fortress, and in my utter solitude my mind began to cease its vain protest against the impending doom, to become almost reconciled to the fate which so many of my ancestors had met. Much of my time was now occupied in the exploration of the ruined and abandoned halls and towers of the old chateau, which in youth fear had caused me to shun, and some of which old Pierre had once told me had not been trodden by human foot for over 4 centuries. Strange and awesome were many of the objects I encountered. Furniture covered by the dust of ages and crumbling with the rot of long dampness met my eyes. Cobwebs in a profusion never before seen by me were spun everywhere, and huge bats flapped their bony and uncanny wings on all sides of the otherwise untenanted gloom. Of my exact age, even down to days and hours, I kept a most careful record, for each movement of the pendulum of the massive clock in the library told me so much more of my doomed existence. At length I approached that time which I had so long viewed with apprehension. Since most of my ancestors has been seized some little while before they reached the exact age of Comte Henry at his end, I was every moment on the watch for the coming of the unknown death. In what strange form the curse should overtake me, I knew not, but I was resolved, at least, that it should not find me cowardly, or a passive victim. With new vigor, I applied myself to my examination of the old chateau and its contents. It was upon one of the longest of all my excursions of discovering the deserted portion of the castle, less than a week before that fatal hour which I felt must mark the utmost limit of my stay on earth, beyond which I could not even have the slightest hope of continuing to draw breath, that I came upon the culminating event of my whole life. I had spent the better part of the morning in climbing up and down half-ruined staircases in one of the most dilapidated of the ancient turrets. As the afternoon progressed, I sought the lower levels, descending into what appeared to be either a medieval place of confinement, or a more recently excavated storehouse for gunpowder. As I slowly traversed the niter-encrusted passageway at the foot of the last staircase, the paving became very damp, and soon I saw by the light of my flickering torch that a blank, water-stained wall impeded my journey. Turning to retrace my steps, my eye fell upon a small trapdoor with a ring, which lay directly beneath my feet. Pausing, I succeeded with difficulty in raising it, whereupon there was revealed a black aperture, exhaling noxious fumes which caused my torch to sputter, and disclosing in the unsteady glare the top of a flight of stone steps. As soon as the torch, which I lowered into repellent depths, burned freely and steadily, I commenced my descent. The steps were many, and led to a narrow stone-flagged passage, which I knew must be far underground. The passage proved of great length, and terminated in a massive oaken door, dripping with the moisture of the place, and stoutly resisting all my attempts to open it. Ceasing after a time my efforts in this direction, I had proceeded back some distance toward the steps, when there suddenly fell to my experience one of the most profound and maddening shocks capable of reception by the human brain. Without warning, I heard the heavy door behind me creak slowly open upon its rusted hinges. My immediate sensations are incapable of analysis. To be confronted in a place as thoroughly deserted as I deemed the old castle, with evidence of the presence of man or spirit, produced in my brain a horror of the most acute description. When I at last turned and faced the seat of the sound, my eyes must have started from their orbits at the sight that they beheld. There in the ancient Gothic doorway stood a human figure. It was that of a man clad in a skull-cap and long medieval tunic of dark color. His long hair and flowing beard were of a terrible and intense black hue, and of incredible profusion. His forehead, high beyond the usual dimensions, his cheeks deep sunken and heavily lined with wrinkles, and his hands, long, claw-like and gnarled, were of such a deathly marble-like whiteness as I have never elsewhere seen in man. His figure, lean to the proportions of a skeleton, were strangely bent, and almost lost within the voluminous folds of his peculiar garment. But strangest of all were his eyes, twin caves of abysmal blackness, profound in expression of understanding, yet inhuman in a degree of wickedness. These were now fixed upon me, piercing my soul with their hatred, rooting me to the spot whereon I stood. At last the figure spoke in a rumbling voice that chilled me through with its dull hollowness and latent malevolence. The language in which the discourse was clothed was that debased form of Latin in use amongst the more learned men of the Middle Ages, and made familiar to me by the prolonged researches into the works of the old alchemists and demonologists. The apparition spoke of the curse which had hovered over my house, told me my coming end, dwelt on a wrong perpetrated by my ancestor against old Michael Mauvais, and gloated over the revenge of Charles Le Saucier. He told me how the young Charles had escaped into the night, returning in after years to kill Godfrey the heir with an arrow just as he approached the age which has been his father's assassination. How he had secretly returned to the estate and established himself, unknown, in the even then deserted subterranean chamber whose doorway now framed the hideous narrator. How he had seized Robert, son of Godfrey, in a field, forced poison down his throat, and left him to die at the age of 32, thus maintaining the foul provisions of his vengeful curse. At this point, I was left to imagine the solution of the greatest mystery of all. How the curse had been fulfilled since that time when Charles Le Saucier must in the course of nature have died. For the man digressed into an account of the deep alchemical studies of the two wizards, father and son, speaking most particularly of the researches of Charles Le Saucier concerning the elixir, which should grant to him who partook of it eternal life and youth. His enthusiasm had seemed for the moment to remove from his terrible eyes the hatred that had at first so haunted him. But suddenly the fiendish glare returned. With a shocking sound like the hissing of a serpent, the stranger raised a glass phial with the evident intent of ending my life, as had Charles Le Saucier 600 years before ended that of my ancestor. Prompted by my preserving instinct of self-defense, I broke through the spell that hitherto held me immovable, and flung my now dying torch at the creature who menaced my existence. I heard the phial break harmlessly against the stones of the passage as the tunic of the strange man caught fire, and lit the horrid scene with a ghastly radiance. The shriek of fright and impotent malice emitted by the would-be assassin proved too much for my already shaken nerves, and I fell prone upon the slimy floor in a total faint. When at last my senses returned, all was frightfully dark, and my mind, remembering what had occurred, shrank from the idea of beholding more. Yet curiosity overmastered all. Who, I asked myself, was this man of evil, and how came he within the castle walls? Why should he seek to avenge the death of poor Michael Mavet, and how had the curse been carried on through all the long centuries since the time of Charles Le Saucier? The dread of years was lifted from my shoulders, for I knew that he whom I had felled was the source of all my danger from the curse, and now that I was free, I burned with the desire to learn more of the sinister thing which had haunted my line for centuries, and made of my own youth one long continued nightmare. Determined upon further exploration, I felt in my pockets for flint and steel, and lit the unused torch which I had with me. First of all, the new light revealed the distorted and blackened form of the mysterious stranger. The hideous eyes were now closed. Disliking the sight, I turned away and entered the chamber beyond the Gothic door. Here I found what seemed much like an alchemist's laboratory. In one corner was an immense pile of shining yellow metal that sparkled gorgeously in the light of the torch. It may have been gold, but I did not pause to examine it, for I was strangely affected by that which I had undergone. At the farther end of the apartment was an opening leading out into one of the many wild ravines of the dark hillside forest. Filled with wonder, yet now realizing how the man had obtained access to the chateau, I proceeded to return. I had intended to pass by the remains of the stranger with averted face, but as I approached the body, I seemed to hear emanating from it a faint sound, as though life were not yet wholly extinct. Aghast, I turned to examine the charred and shriveled figure on the floor. Then all at once, with horrible eyes, blacker even than the seared face in which they were set, opened wide with an expression which I was unable to interpret. The cracked lips tried to frame words which I could not well understand. Once I caught the name of Charles Le Saucier, and again I fancied that the words years and curse issued from the twisted mouth. Still, I was at a loss to gather the purpose of his disconnected speech. At my evident ignorance of his meaning, the pitchy eyes once more flashed malevolent at me, till helplessly, as I saw my opponent to be, I trembled as I watched him. Suddenly the wretch, animated with his last birch of strength, raised his hideous head from the damp and sunken pavement. Then, as I remained, paralyzed with fear, he found his voice, and in his dying breath screamed forth those words which have ever afterward haunted my days and nights. "Fool!" he shrieked. "Can you not guess my secret? Have you no brain whereby you may recognize the will which has through 6 long centuries fulfilled the dreadful curse upon your house? Have I not told you of the great elixir of eternal life? Know you not how the secret of alchemy was solved? I tell you it is I that have lived for 600 years to maintain my revenge. For I am Charles Le Sorcier. And then I guess he just fucking died because that's all he wrote. And that book is heavy. That is a real pain upon the wrist. I pulled away from my mic a little bit, so hopefully that wasn't too loud. This is the other side of my desk. Some people complain it's quite quiet, but it does still seem to be picking up a decent amount of decibels, so maybe it's just Discord doing something fucky wucky. Who knows? If I jump scared you. This is horror reading, not happy bedtime. So my apologies, but also what were you expecting? Just gotta take a brief break to drink some tea, rest my throat. Hopefully everyone's doing alright. Cat pats for Tsubaki. We'll also roll a die for the next one. That is a 2 again. How? But why are you rolling so pitifully low? You're a D60. Like, I've repeatedly rolled beneath 10. I've repeatedly rolled 2. That seems statistically improbable. Like, are you just rolling a D6? Is that the problem? Google, you should be better than this. Okay, 56, that's better. Oh god, I have a count. Just count backwards. 60, 59, 58, 57, 56. That is a long one. This one is The Thing on the Doorstep. It is 22 pages, so it will probably take me a fair bit longer. I could probably just pull up the PDF online, but where the fun in that be? Oh god, it has chapters. That's how long this is. So I will be taking a bit of a break each chapter. Which also means we will potentially be doing the tarot readings between chapters. Also going to, one moment, I'm going to mute myself and move my microphone. Alright, there we go. That way my book is properly upon my desk so that I don't have to hold however heavy this thing is in one hand while I flip through it and do other stuff. And also, hello, Pig Catapult. Hopefully you're faring well. Welcome to the stream. We just finished reading The Alchemist, and we're about to start reading The Thing on the Doorstep, after I spend another minute or two sipping some tea and resting my throat. Technically speaking, I probably should have gone for something closer to an ASMR stream, or I really should have stuck with just a shorter gaming stream as opposed to reading, considering I read day in, day out during my day job, and I'm about to spend In 12 hours of work day for the next 3 days, reading scripts to people. But this is what I have chosen for myself. Yes, normally I am very much a gaming channel of the variety nature. Um, but at least partly since this is the last week of Spooky Month, and partly since Halloween is coming up, although I still haven't figured out plans for that, I, at least during the in-between segments, I can use closer to a softer ASMR voice as opposed to having to put on tone and voices and whatever the fuck when it comes to actual story reading. But yes, in addition to all that, I also work a lot of overtime this week. I'm working a 60-hour work week in order to help me get out of debt. Today I worked 9 hours, which isn't really that bad. Sorry, I worked 8 hours. But Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, I will be working 12 hours each. Then I'll be working another 8-hour shifts Saturday and Sunday. I also worked that long this Saturday and that Sunday and had a full week of work, so it is a busy, busy period. And I'm looking forward to that overtime pay. At any rate, tea time. Time for tea. Excuse me. Depending on how long this story is, and I mean it is 21 pages long and it is broken into chapters, it's possible that this may be the last story we read tonight. We'll see how things go. Like I said, I'm trying to aim towards somewhere around the 2-hour mark, maybe 2.5 to 3. Also, just as a reminder, or to let the newer people know, I'm also offering tarot readings during the stream. There are a few different options there. Either if you're a long-term viewer or you save up enough points during, you can simply do a 5,000 point redeem down below among the other point redeems. Or if you're a newer viewer or you can or wish to spare the money, you can give me a $5 donation anyway. There's a donation link through Stream Elements below. You can give me 500 bits, or you can just give someone a sub. I know gifting someone a sub doesn't really give me $5, but it costs you $5 and it's good for the channel as a whole, so close enough. With that out of the way, the thing on the doorstep. This story was written somewhat frenetically on August 21st to 24th, 1933. Lovecraft admitted that the literary inspiration of the story was H.B. Drake's novel, The Shadowy Thing, certainly has a similar title, 1928, first published in England as The Remedy in 1925, in which a man develops the power of hypnosis to such a degree that he can exchange personalities with his victim. Lovecraft has altered this plot so that a man and his wife exchange personalities. Thanks for the fucking spoiler. A detail Lovecraft may have derived from Barry Payne's novel An Exchange of Souls, 1911. The character of Asenath White appears to be a fusion of Lovecraft's mother and ex-wife, but the character of Edward Derby is not entirely based on Lovecraft himself. It's a drawing also upon Lovecraft's use of his friends Clark Ashton Smith and Frank Belknap Long. The story was published in Weird Tales, January 1937. Love us a good Freaky Friday flip, although it is certainly an odd title for something like that. It is true that I have sent 6 bullets through the head of my best friend, and yet I hope to show by this statement that I am not his murderer. At first I shall be called a madman, madder than the man I shot in a cell at the Arkham Sanitarium. Later, some of my readers will weigh each statement, correlate it with the known facts, and ask themselves how I could have believed otherwise than as I did after facing the evidence of that horror, that thing on the doorstep. Until then, I also saw nothing but madness in the wild tales I've acted upon. Even now I ask myself whether I was misled, or whether I am not mad at all. I do not know, but others have strange things to tell of Edward and Asenath Derby. And Even the stolid police are at their wits' end to account for the last terrible visit. They've tried weakly to concoct a theory of ghastly jest or warning by discharged servants, yet they know in their hearts that the truth is something infinitely more terrible and incredible. So I say that I have not murdered Edward Derby. Rather have I avenged him, and in doing so purged the earth of a horror whose survival might have loosed untold terrors on all mankind. There are black zones of shadow close to our daily paths, and now and then some evil soul breaks a passage through. When that happens, the man who knows must strike before reckoning the consequences. I have known Edward Pickman Derby all his life. 8 years my junior, he was so precocious that we had much in common from the time he was 8 and I 16. He was the most phenomenal child scholar I have ever known, and at 7 was writing verse of a psalm. Fantastic, almost morbid cast, which astonished the tutors surrounding him. Perhaps his private education and cold seclusion had something to do with his premature flowering. An only child, he had organic weaknesses which startled his doting parents and caused them to keep closely chained to his side. He was never allowed out without his nurse, seldom had a chance to play unconstrainedly with other children. All this doubtless fostered a strange, secreted inner life in a boy, with imagination as his one avenue of freedom. At any rate, his juvenile learning was prodigious and bizarre, and his facile writings such as to captivate me despite my greater age. About that time I had learning toward the art of a somewhat grotesque cast, and I found in this younger child a rare kindred spirit. What lay beyond our joint love of shadows and marvels was, no doubt, the ancient, mouldering, and subtly fearsome town in which we lived. Witch-cursed legend haunted Arkham, whose huddled, sagging gambrel roofs and crumbling Georgian balustrades brood off the centuries beside the darkly muttering Miskatonic. As time went by, I turned to architecture and gave up my design of illustrating a book of Edward's daimonic poems. Yet our comradeship suffered no lessening. Young Derby's odd genius developed remarkably. In his 18th year, his collected nightmare lyrics made a real sensation when issued under the title... One moment, this is hard to read. Partly because there's a mark upon the page, partly due to the markings on the page beneath, and partly because it has special characters. Made a real sensation when issued under the title Aberhoff and Other Horrors. He was a close correspondent of the notorious Baudelarian poet Justin Geoffrey, who wrote The People of the Monolith and died screaming in a madhouse in 1926 after a visit to a sinister, ill-regarded village in Hungary. In self-reliance and practical affairs, however, Derby was greatly retarded because of his coddled existence. His health had improved, but his habits of childish dependence were fostered by over-careful parents, so that he never travelled alone, made independent decisions, or assumed responsibilities. It was early seen that he would not be equal to a struggle in a business or professional area, but the family fortune was so ample that this formed no tragedy. As he grew to years of manhood, he retained a deceptive aspect of boyishness. Blond and blue-eyed, he had the fresh complexion of a child, and his attempts to raise a mustache were discernible only with difficulty. His voice was soft and light, and his pampered and exercised life gave him a juvenile chubbiness rather than the paunchiness of premature middle age. He was of good height, and his handsome face would have made him a notable gallant had his shyness held him no seclusion and bookishness. Derby's parents took him abroad every summer. He was quick to seize on the surface aspects of European thought and expression. His Poe-like talents turned more and more toward the decadent, and other artistic sensitivities and yearnings were half aroused in him. We had great discussions in those days.
I'd been through Harvard, had studied in a Boston architect's office, had married, and had finally returned to Arkham to practice my profession, settling in the family homestead in Selston Street. Since my father had moved to Florida for his health, Edward used to call almost every morning, till I came to regard him as one of the household. He had a characteristic way of ringing the doorbell or sounding the knocker that grew to be a veritable code signal, so that after dinner I always listened for the familiar 3 brisk strokes, followed by 2 more after a pause. Less frequently, I would visit at his house and note with envy the obscure volumes in his constantly growing library. Derby went through Miskatonic University in Arkham, since his parents would not let him board away from them. He entered at 16, completed his course in 3 years, majoring in English and French literature, and receiving high marks in everything but mathematics and sciences. He mingled very little with the other students, though looking enviously at the daring or bohemian set, whose superficially smart language and meaningless ironic pose he aped, whose dubious conduct he wished he almost dared adopt. What he did do was to become an almost fanatical devotee of subterranean magical lore, for which Miskatonic's library was and is famous. Always a dweller on the surface of fantasy and strangeness, he now delved deep into the actual runes and riddles left by a fabulous past for the guidance or puzzlement of posterity. He read things like the Frightful Book of Avon, the Onusprecklichen Kulten de von Junts, and the forbidden Necronomicon of the mad Arab Abdul al-Razad, although he did not tell his parents he had seen them. Edward was 20 when my son and only child was born, and seemed pleased when I named the newcomer Edward Derby Upton after him. By the time he was 25, Edward Derby was a prodigiously learned man, and a fairly well-known poet and fantast, although his lack of contacts or responsibilities had slowed down his literary growth by making his products derivative and overbookish. I was perhaps his closest friend, finding him an inexhaustible mine of vital theoretical topics. Excuse me. Which he relied on me for advice in whatever matters he did not wish to refer to his parents. He remained single, more through shyness, inertia, and parental protectiveness than through inclination, and moved in society only to the slightest and most perfunctory extent. When the war came, both health and ingrained timidity kept him at home. I went to Plattsburgh for a commission, but never got overseas. Though the year wore on, Edward's mother died when he was 34, and for months he was incapacitated by some odd psychological malady. His father took him to Europe, however, and he managed to laugh his trouble without visible effects. Afterward, he seemed to feel a sort of grotesque exhilaration, as if of partial escape from some unseen bondage. He began to mingle in the more advanced college set, despite his middle age, was present at some extremely wild doings, on one occasion paying heavy blackmail, which he borrowed of me, to keep his presence at a certain affair from his father's notice. Some of the whispered rumors of a wild Miskatonic set were extremely singular. There was even talk of black magic, and of happenings utterly beyond credibility. Chapter 2. Sorry about that, I accidentally bumped my mic. Trying to figure out a good way to turn myself so that I can hold this even more comfortably without fucking bumping into anything. Let's try this with the mic kinda above my head a little bit. Yeah, it should be fine. That looks like I'm coming through decently enough. I'll lower just a little bit.
Edward was 38 when he met Asenath White. He was, I judge, about 23 at the time, and was taking a special course in medieval metaphysics at Miskatonic. The daughter of a friend of mine had met her before in the Hall School at Kingsport, and had been inclined to shun her because of her odd reputation. She was dark, smallish, and very good-looking, except for over-protuberant eyes, but something in her expression alienated extremely sensitive people. It was, however, largely her origin and conversation which caused average folk to avoid her. She was one of the Innsmouth Whites, and dark legends have clustered for generations about crumbling, half-deserted Innsmouth and its people. There are tales of horrible bargains about the year 1850, and of a strange element not quite human in the ancient families of the run-down fishing port. Tales such as only old-time Yankees can devise a repeat with proper awesomeness. Asenath's case was aggravated by the fact that she was Ephraim White's daughter, child of his old age by an unknown wife who always went veiled. Ephraim lived in a half-decayed mansion in Washington Street, Innsmouth, and those who had seen the place, Arkham folk avoid going to Innsmouth whenever they can, and declared that the attic windows were always boarded, and that strange sounds sometimes floated from them as evening drew on. The old man was known to have been a prodigious magical student in his day, and legend averred that he could raise or quell storms at sea according to his whim. I'd seen him once or twice in my youth as he came to Arkham to consult forbidden tomes at the local college. I had hated his wolfish, saturnine face with his tangle of iron grey beard. He had died insane, under rather queer circumstances, just before his daughter, by his will made a nominal ward of the principal, entered the Hall School, but she had been his morbidly avid pupil and looked fiendishly like him at times. Excuse me. The friend whose daughter had gone to school with Asenath White repeated many curious things when the news of Edward's acquaintance with her began to spread about. Asenath, it seemed, had posed as a kind of magician at school, and had really seemed able to accomplish some highly baffling marvels. She professed to be able to raise thunderstorms, though her seeming success was generally laid to some uncanny knack at prediction. All animals markedly disliked her, and she could make any dog howl by certain motions of her right hand. There were times when she displayed snatches of knowledge and language very singular, and very shocking, for a young girl, when she would frighten her schoolmates with leers and winks of an inexplicable kind. It seemed to extract an obscene and zestful irony from her present situation. Most unusual, though, were the well-attested cases of her influence over other persons. She was, beyond question, a genuine hypnotist. By gazing peculiarly at a fellow student, she would often give the latter a distinct feeling of exchanged personality, as if the subject were placed momentarily in the magician's body, able to stare half across the room at her real body, whose eyes blazed and protruded with an alien expression. Asenath often made wild claims about the nature of consciousness, and about its independence of the physical frame, or at least from the life processes of the physical frame. Her crowning rage, however, was that she was not a man, since she believed a male brain had certain unique and far-reaching cosmic powers. Given a man's brain, she declared, she could not only equal but surpass her father in mastery of unknown forces. Edward met Asenath at a gathering of intelligentsia, whatever that means, held in one of the students' rooms, and could talk of nothing else when he came to see me the next day. He'd found her full of interest in erudition, which engrossed him most, and was in addition wildly taken by her appearance. I'd never seen the young woman, and recalled casual references only faintly, but I knew who she was. It seemed rather regrettable that Derby should become so peeved about her, but I said nothing to discourage him, since infatuation thrives on opposition. He was not, he said, mentioning her to his father. In the next few weeks I heard of very little but Asenath from young Derby. Others now remarked Edward's autumnal gallantry, though they agreed that he did not look even nearly his actual age, or seem at all inappropriate as he escort for a bizarre divinity. He was only a trifle paunchy despite his indolence and self-indulgence, and his face was absolutely without lines. Asenath, on the other hand, had the premature crow's feet from which come the exercise of an intense will. About this time, Edward brought the girl to call on me, and I at once saw his interest was by no means one-sided. She eyed him continuously, with an almost predatory air. I perceived that her intimacy was beyond untangling. Soon afterward, I had a visit from old Mr. Darby, whom I had always admired and respected. He had heard the tales of his son's new friendship, and had wormed the whole truth out of the boy. Edward meant to marry Asenath, and had even been looking at houses in the suburbs. Knowing my usually great influence with his son, the father wondered if I could help to break the ill-advised affair off. I regretfully expressed my doubts. This time it was not a question of Edward's weak will, but of the woman's strong will. The perennial child had transferred his dependence from the parental image to a new and stronger image, and nothing could be done about it. The wedding was performed a month later, by a justice of the peace, according to the bride's request. Mr. Darby, at my advice, offered no opposition, and he, my wife, my son, and I attended the brief ceremony, the other guests being wild young people from the college. Asenath had bought the old... Asenath had bought the old Crowningshield place? Crowningshield? Make of that as you will. In the country at the end of High Street, and they proposed to settle there after a short trip to Innsmouth, whence 3 servants and some books and household goods were to be wrought. It was probably not so consideration for Edward and his father as a personal wish to be near the college, its library, and its crowd of sophisticates that made Asenath settle in Alchemist for returning permanently home. When Edward called on me after the honeymoon, I thought he looked slightly changed. Asenath had made him get rid of the underdeveloped mustache, but there was more than that. He looked soberer and more thoughtful, his habitual pout of childish rebelliousness being exchanged for a look of almost genuine sadness. I was puzzled to decide whether I liked or disliked the change. Certainly, he seemed for a moment more normally adult than ever before. Perhaps the marriage was a good thing. Might not the change of dependence form a start toward actual neutralization, leading ultimately to responsible independence? He came alone, for Asenath was very busy. She had brought a vast store of books and apparatus from Innsmouth. Darby shuddered as he spoke the name, and was finishing the restoration in Crowningshield house in the grounds. Her home, in that town, was a rather disquieting place, but certain objects in it had taught him some surprising things. He was progressing fast in esoteric lore now that he had Asenath's guidance. Some of the experiments she proposed were very daring and radical. He did not feel at liberty to describe them, but he had confidence in her powers and intentions. The 3 servants were very queer, an incredibly aged couple who had been with old Ephraim and referred occasionally to him and to Asenath's dead mother in a cryptic way, and a swarthy young wench who had marked abnormalities of feature and seemed to exude a perpetual odor of fish. Welcome back from dinner, Tsubaki. Just taking a quick break to rest my throat and drink some tea. We are on the third, well, we just finished the second chapter, and we'll soon be on the third chapter of the thing on the doorstep. Given we're taking about 10 minutes per chapter, this will probably be the last story of the stream, even if it is the second. Obviously, some Lovecraft stuff gonna run long. This one's about 21 pages, so. Sorry that you're feeling sick. Many extra headpats for the bun. Get well soon. And meanwhile, I assume there shouldn't be any random loud old man screaming about how he's some immortal douchebag. So hopefully the sounds of my voice will help lull you to sleep. And then I'll randomly scream to wake you up because, probably not. And pat, 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 pat. And pat, 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 the bun. There. Good boy. Get well soon. And rest well. Fucking Mr. Charles, the sorcerer. I love her. I couldn't think of any other name than Charles. Like, it's an age name. It's just not the most intimidating of names, and is still memed upon to this day. Albeit in increasingly small groups, depending on how many people actually read Lovecraft. I'm definitely going to try to keep these streams to around 2 hours, considering my throat's already starting to hurt a little bit. I might mix some tea, maybe even a little bit of cinnamon. Well, maybe a hot toddy. No, not a. Maybe just like a cup. It'll help me fall asleep, I suppose. I prefer not to drink the night before the stream, but a hot toddy would probably be good for my throat. I don't know where my fireball is, though. Don't have to put cinnamon into my hot toddy if I'm already using cinnamon whiskey. But either way, yes, throat sore. Anywho, Chapter 3. For the next 2 years, I saw less and less of Derby. Fortnite would sometimes slip by without the familiar 3 and 2 strokes at the front door. And when he did call, or when this happened with increasing in frequency, I called on him, he was very little disposed to converse on vital topics. He became secretive about those occult studies which he used to describe and discuss so minutely, and preferred not to talk of his wife. She had aged tremendously since her marriage, till now. Oddly enough, she seemed the elder of the two. Her face held the most concentratedly determined expression I had ever seen, and her whole aspect seemed to gain a vague, unplaceable repulsiveness. My wife and son noticed it as much as I, and we all ceaselessly gradually to call upon her, for which Edward, admittedly in one of his boyishly tactless moments, she was unmitigatedly grateful. Occasionally the Derbys would go on long trips, ostensibly to Europe, though Edward sometimes hinted at obscure destinations. It was after the first year that people began talking about the change in Edward Derby. It was very casual talk, for the change was purely psychological, but it brought up some interesting points. Now and then, it seems, Edward was observed to wear an expression and to do things wholly incompatible with his usual flabby nature. For example, although in the old days he could not drive a car, he was now seen occasionally to dash into or out of the old Crowningshield driveway with Asinov's powerful Packard, handling it like a master, and meeting traffic entanglements with a skill and determination utterly alien to his accustomed nature. In such cases, he always seemed to be just back from some trip, or just starting on one. What sort of trip, no one could guess, although he mostly favored the Innsmouth route. Oddly, the metamorphosis did not seem altogether pleasing. People said he looked too much like his wife, or like old Ephraim Waite himself in these days. Or perhaps these moments seemed unnaturally because they were so rare. Sometimes, hours after starting out this way, he would return listlessly sprawled out in the rear seat of his car, while an obviously hired chauffeur or mechanic drove. Also, his preponderant aspect on the streets during the decreasing round of social contacts, including, I may say, his calls on me, was the old-time indecisive one, its irresponsible childness even more marked than in the past. While Asenath's face aged, Edward's, aside from those exceptional occasions, actually relaxed into a kind of exaggerated immaturity, save when a trace of the new sadness or understanding would flash across it. It was really very puzzling. Meanwhile, the Derbys almost dropped out of the gay college circle. Not through their own disgust, we heard, but because something about their present studies shocked even the most callous of the other decadents. It was in the third year of marriage that Edward began to hint openly to me of a certain fear and dissatisfaction. He would let fall remarks about things going too far. He would talk darkly about the need of saving his identity. At first I ignored such references, but in time I began to question him guardedly, remembering what my friend's daughter had said about Asenath's hypnotic influence over the other girls at school. The cases where students had thought they were in her body, looking across the room at themselves. This questioning seemed to make him at once alarmed and grateful, and once he mumbled something about having a serious talk with me later. About this time, old Mr. Darby died, and which I was afterward very thankful. Edward was badly upset, though by no means disorganized. He had seemed astonishingly little of his parent since his marriage, and that had concentrated herself all his vital sense of family lineage. Some called him callous in his loss, especially since his jaunty and confident moods in the car began to increase. He now wished to move back into the old Derby mansion, but Asenath insisted on staying in a Crowningshield's house, to which she had become well adjusted. Not long afterward, my wife heard a curious thing from a friend, one of the few who had not dropped the Darbys. She had been out to the end of High Street to call on the couple, and had seen a car shoot briskly out of the drive with Edward's oddly confident and almost sneering face at the wheel. Ringing the bell, she had been told by the repulsive wench that Asenath was also out, but had chanced to look upon the house and leaving. There, at one of Edward's library windows, she had glimpsed a hastily withdrawn face whose expression of pain, defeat, and wistful hopelessness was poignant beyond description. It was incredible enough in view of its usual domineering cast, Athena's, yet the caller had vowed that in that instant the sad, muddled eyes of the poor Edward were gazing out from it. Edward's call now grew a trifle more frequent, as hence occasionally became concrete. What he said was not to be believed, even in the century-ridden legend haunted Arkham, but he threw out his dark lore with a sincerity and convincingness that made one fear for his sanity. He talked about terrible meetings in lonely places, of cyclopean ruins in the heart of the main woods beneath which vast staircases led down into abysses of nighted secrets, of complex angles that led through invisible walls to other regions of space and time. Ah, yes, the complexity of right angles. Don't drive past, kids. And of hideous exchanges of personality that permitted explorations in remote and forbidden places, on other worlds, and in different time continua. He would now and then back up certain crazy hints by exhibiting objects which utterly nonplussed me. Elusively colored and happeningly textured objects like nothing ever heard of on Earth, whose insane curves and surfaces answered no conceivable purpose and followed no conceivable geometry. These things, he said, came from outside, and his wife knew how to get them. Sometimes, but always in frightened and ambiguous whispers, he would suggest things about old Ephraim White, who he had seen occasionally at a college library in the old days. These adumbrations were never specific, but seemed to revolve around some especially horrible doubt as to whether the old wizard were really dead, in the spiritual as well as corporeal sense. At times, Derby would halt abruptly in his revelations, and I wondered whether Asenath could possibly have divined his speech at a distance, and him off through some unknown sort of telepathic mesmerism, some power of the kind she had displayed at school. Certainly she suspected that he told me things, for as the weeks passed she tried to stop his visits with words and glances of a most inexplicable potency. Only with difficulty could he get to see me, for although he would pretend to be going somewhere else, some invisible force would generally clog his motions and make him forget his destination for the time being. His visits usually came when Asenath was away in her own body, as he once oddly put it. She always found out later. Servants watched his goings and comings, but evidently she thought it inexpedient to do anything drastic. Yeah, like I said earlier, perhaps reading streams aren't the greatest idea after, hours upon hours of work with a little break. Like, the last day I had off was, the 20th. So I have had less than a week. It's been more than a week since I've had a day off. And the next day I have off is the 31st. And the next few days I'll be working 12-hour shifts. So this is probably a terrible idea, but hey, it's what I want to do, and it'll be short. And I've been wanting to do reading streams anyways. Definitely only reading the second story, though. Leastwise because I'm out of tea, and I don't want to go downstairs to get more. I do have some water, but tea is different on throat than water. I need to start looking into how to do like vocal warm-ups and exercises. Chapter 4. Derby had been married more than 3 years on that August day when I got the telegram from Maine. I had not seen him for 2 months, but had heard he was away on business. Asenath was supposed to be with him, though watchful gossips declared that there was someone upstairs in a house behind the doubly curtained windows. They had watched the purchases made by the servants, and now the town marshal of Chesacook had wired off the draggled madman who stumbled out of the woods with delirious ravings and screamed to me for protection. It was Edward. He had just been able to recall his own name, and my name and address. Chesacook is close to the wildest, deepest, and least explored forest belt in Maine. It took a whole day of feverish jolting through fantastic and forbidden scenery to get there in a car. I found Derby in a cell at the town farm, vacillating between frenzy and apathy. He knew me at once, began pouring out a meaningless, half-incoherent torrent of words in my direction. Then, for God's sake, the pit of the Shoggoths, down the 6,000 steps, the abominations of abominations. I never would let her take me, and I found myself there. Yeah, Shub-Nagora. Cape rose up from the altar, and there were 500 that howled. The hooded thing bleated, Cog, Cog. It was only from secret name in the coven. I was there. She promised she wouldn't take me. A minute before I was locked in the library, and then I was there when she had gone for my body. They sought her blasphemy, the unholy pit where the black realm begins and the Washakart's gate. I shot a Shoggoth. It changed shape. Stand. I'll kill her if she ever sends me there again. I'll kill that entity or him. I'll kill it. I'll kill her with my own hands. It took me an hour to quiet him, but he subsided at last. The next day, I got him decent clothes in the village and set out with him for Arkham. His fury of hysteria was spent. He was inclined to be silent, though he began muttering darkly to himself when a car passed through Augusta, as if the sight of a city aroused unpleasant memories. It was clear that he did not wish to go home, considering the fantastic delusions he seemed to have about his wife. Delusions undoubtedly springing from some actual hypnotic ordeal to which he had been subjected. I thought it better if he did not. I would, I resolved, put him up myself for a time, no matter what unpleasantness it would make with Asenath. Later, I would help him get a divorce, for most assuredly there were mental factors which made this marriage suicidal for him. When we struck open country again, Derby's muttering faded away. I gnawed and browsed on the seat beside me as I drove. During our sunset dash through Portland, the muttering commenced again, more distinctly than before. And as I listened, I caught a stream of utterly insane drivel about Hasselhoff. The extent to which she had preyed upon Edward's nerves was plain, for he had woven a whole set of hallucinations about her. I lost my place. His present predicament, he mumbled furtively, was only one of a long series. He was getting hold of him, and he knew that someday she would never let go. Even now, he probably let him go only when she had to, because she couldn't hold on long at a time. He constantly took his body and went to the nameless plains for nameless rites, leaving him in her body and locking him upstairs. But sometimes she couldn't hold on. He would find himself suddenly in his own body again for some far-off, horrible, and perhaps unknown place. Sometimes she'd get a hold of him again. Sometimes she couldn't. Often he was left stranded in somewhere as I had found him. Time and time again, he had to find his way home from frightful distances, getting somebody to drive the car after he found it. The worst thing was that she was holding on to him longer and longer at a time. She wanted to be a man, be fully human. That was why she had got hold of him. She had sensed the mixture of fine wrought brain and weak will in him. Some day she would crowd him out and disappear with his body. Disappear to become a great magician like her father, and leave him marooned in that female shell that wasn't even human. Yes, he knew about the Innsmouth blood now. There had been traffic with things from the sea. It was horrible. And old Ephraim, he had known the secret. And when he grew old, did a hideous thing to keep alive. He wanted to live forever. Salah would succeed. One successful demonstration had taken place already. As Derby muttered on, I turned to look at him closely, verifying the impression of change which an earlier scrutiny had given me. Paradoxically, he seemed in better shape than usual, harder, more developed, naturally, and without the trace of sickly flabbiness caused by his indolent habits. As if he had been really active and properly exercised for the first time in his cold life. I judged that Asnath's force must have pushed him into an unwanted channels of motion and alertness. But just now his mind was in the unwanted channels of motion and alertness. A pitiable state, for he was mumbling wild extravagances about his wife, about black magic, about Ephraim, about some revelation which would convince even me. He repeated names which I recognized from bygone browsings in forbidden volumes, and at times made me shudder with a certain thread of mythological consistency, of convincing coherence, which ran through his mantering. Again and again he would pause as if to gather courage for some final and terrible disclosure. Dan, don't you remember him? The wild eyes and the unkempt beard that never turned white. He glared at me once, and I never forgot it. Now she glares that way, and I know why. He found it in the Necronomicon, the formula. I don't dare tell you the page yet, but when I do you can read and understand. Then you'll know what's engulfed me. On and on and on and on, body to body to body, she means to never to die. The life glow. He knows how to break the link. It can flicker on a while, even when the body is dead. I'll give you hints, and maybe you'll listen. Listen, Dan. Do you know why my wife always takes such pains with that silly backhand writing? Have you ever seen a manuscript of old Ephraim's? Do you want to know why I shivered when I saw some hasty notes Asenath had jotted down? Asenath. Is there such a person? Why do they have to think that there was poison in old Ephraim's stomach? Why do the Gilmans whisper about the way he shrieked like a frightened child when he went mad and Asenath locked him up in the attic room where the other had been? Was it old Ephraim's soul that was locked in? Who locked in whom? Why had he been looking for months for someone with a fine mind and a weak will? Why did he curse that his daughter wasn't the son? Hell me, Daniel Upton. What devilish exchange was perpetuated in that house of horror where that blasphemous monster had his trusting, weak-willed, half-human child at his mercy? Didn't he make it permanent? As she'll do in the end with me. Tell me why that thing that calls itself Asenath writes differently when off guard, so that you can't tell the script from. Then the thing happened. Derby's voice was raising to a thin treble scream as he raved, when suddenly it was shut off with an almost mechanical click. I thought of those other occasions at my home when his confidences had abruptly ceased, when I'd half fancied that some obscure telepathic wave of Asenath's mental force was intervening to keep him silent. This, though, was something altogether different. I felt infinitely more horrible. The face beside me was twisted almost unrecognizably for a moment, while through the whole body there passed a shivering motion, as if old bones, organs, muscles, nerves, and glands were readjusting themselves to a radically different position, posture, set of stresses, and general personality. Just where the supreme horror lay, I could not for my life tell you. But there swept over me such a swamping wave of sickness and repulsion, such a freezing, petrifying sense of utter alienage and abnormality, that my grasp of the wheel grew feeble and uncertain. The figure beside me seemed less like a lifelong friend than like some monstrous intrusion from outer space, some damnable, utter, accursed focus of unknown and malign cosmic forces. I faltered only a moment. Before another moment was over, my companion had seized the wheel and forced me to change places with him. The dusk was now very thick. I supported them far behind, so I could not see much of his face. The blaze of his eyes, though, was phenomenal, and I knew that he must now be in that queerly energized state, so unlike his usual self, which so many people had noticed. It seemed odd and incredible that listless Edward Barby, he who could never assert himself, and who had never learned to drive, should be ordering me about and taking the wheel of my own car, as that was precisely what had happened. He did not speak for some time, and in my inexplicable horror, I was glad that he did not. In Eliza Biddeford and Sacco, I saw his firmly set mouth, and shivered at the blaze of his eyes. The people were right. He did look damnably like his wife and like old Ephraim when in these moods. I did not wonder that the moods were disliked. There was certainly something unnatural and diabolic in them. I felt the sinister element all the more because of the wild ravings I'd been hearing. This man, for all my lifelong knowledge of the Edward Pickman Derby, was a stranger. An intrusion of some force from the black abyss. He did not speak until we were on a dark stretch of road. And when he did, his voice seemed utterly unfamiliar to me. It was deeper, firmer, and more decisive than I'd ever known it to be, while his accent and pronunciations were altogether changed, though vaguely, remotely, and rather disturbingly recalling something I could not quite place. There was, I thought, a trace of very profound and very genuine irony in the timbre. Not the flashy, meaningless, jaunty pseudo-irony of the callow sophisticate, which Derby had habitually affected. Something grim, basic, persuasive, and potentially evil. I marveled at the self-possession so soon following the spell of panic-struck muttering. "I hope you'll forget my attack back there, Upton," he was saying. "You know what my nerves are, and I guess you can excuse such things. I'm enormously grateful, of course, for this lift home. And you must forget, too, any crazy things that I may have been saying about my wife, and about things in general. That's what comes from overstudying in a field like mine. My philosophy is full of bizarre concepts. When the mind gets worn out, it cooks up all sorts of imaginary and concrete applications. I shall take a rest from now on. You probably won't see me for some time, and you needn't blame Asenath for it. This trip was a bit queer, but it's really very simple. There are certain Indian relics in the North Woods, standing stones and all that, which mean a good deal in folklore, and Asenath and I are following that stuff up. It was a hard search, so I seem to have gone off my head. I must send somebody for the car when I get home. A month's relaxation will put me back on my feet. I do not recall just what part of the conversation was, for the baffling alienage of my seatmate filled all my consciousness. With every moment my feeling of elusive cosmic horror increased, till at length I was in virtual delirium at longing for the end of the drive. Derby did not offer to relinquish the wheel, and I was glad of the speed with which Portsmouth and Newburyport flashed by. At the junction where the main highway run inland and avoids inland, my driver would take the bleak shore road that goes through that damnable place. He did not, however, but darted rapidly past Rowley and switched toward our destination. We reached Arkham before midnight. We found the lights still on in the old Crowning Shield house. Derby left the car with a hasty repetition of his thanks, and I drove home alone with a curious feeling of relief. It had been a terrible drive, all the more terrible because I could not quite tell why, and I did not regret Derby's forecast of a long absence from my company. Time to drink a bit more water. Hopefully everyone is doing well so far. Drinking plenty of their own water, having any dinner or breakfast. Probably some of you got some good rest or will get some new rest. Maybe you're getting some rest right now listening to me read. Aside from the ache in my head and my throat, I'm enjoying myself at least. Some of these stories I haven't even properly read myself before. And even if I had, it's been long enough that they're relatively fresh, so I apologize for any oddities in terms of tone. At least partly due to similar ache in my neck, which might be part of the source for my headache. Like I said, the book is also inordinately heavy, so I'm having to constantly adjust myself, which means I might be at different angles or relatively different distances from the mic. But I'm trying to keep roughly the same distance overall, so hopefully my volume isn't changing too much either. Aside from obviously quieting down in the interim so that I can, rest my voice just a little bit. I'm glad to hear you've got some water. It's always important to stay hydrated. I believe we're about halfway through, just going by page count. Like I said, this particular story is about 21 pages. Next chapter will be 5. Although it looks like it only goes up to chapters 7 or 8, but obviously some are longer than others. I may have to take a mid-chapter break, depending on how things go. After the next chapter, I'm going to have to go and use the restroom, though. Because, well, the obvious outcome of drinking a bunch of water and tea. More so the tea, since, caffeine. Discord says, did you know Boo? Yes, I do know that. Thank you, Discord. Thank you very much. Very, very useful information. Excuse me. Alright. Chapter 5. The next 2 months were full of rumors. Oh wait, hold on, accent. People spoke of saying Derby moved more and more in his new energized state. And Athanath was scarcely ever in our few callers. I had only one visit from Edward, and he called briefly in Athanath's car, duly reclaimed from wherever he had left it in Maine, to get some books he had lent me. He was in his new state, and paused only long enough for some evasively polite remarks. It was plain that he had nothing to discuss with me when he gave me this condition, and as I had not even troubled to give the old 3 and 2 signal when ringing the doorbell. As on that evening in the car, I felt a faint, indefinitely deep horror, which I could not explain, so that his swift departure was a prodigious relief. In mid-September, Derby was away for a week, and so the decadent college set talked knowingly of the matter, hinting at a meeting with a notorious cult leader, lately expelled from England, who had established headquarters in New York. For my part, I could not get that strange ride from Maine out of my head. The transformation I had witnessed had affected me profoundly, and I caught myself again and again trying to account for the thing, for the extreme horror it had inspired in me. But the oddest rumors were those about the sobbing in the old Crowning Shield house. The voice seemed to be a woman's, and some of the younger people thought it sounded like Asenath's. It was heard only at rare intervals, would sometimes be choked off as if by force. There was talk of an investigation, but this was dispelled one day when Asenath appeared in the streets and chatted in a sprightly way with a large number of acquaintances, apologizing for her recent absences and speaking incidentally about the nervous breakdowns and hysteria of a guest from Boston. The guest was never seen, but Asenath's appearance left nothing to be said. Then some to complicate matters by whispering that the sobs had once or twice been in a man's voice. One evening in mid-October, I heard a familiar 3 and 2 spring at the doorbell. Answering it myself, I found Edward on the steps and saw a moment that his personality was the old one which I had not encountered since the day of his ravings on that terrible ride from Chesungook. His face was twitching with a mixture of odd emotions in which fear and triumph seemed to share dominion, and he looked furtively over his shoulder as I closed the door behind him. Following me clumsily to the study, he asked for some whiskey to steady his nerves. I forbore to question him, but waited till he felt like beginning whatever he wanted to say. At length he ventured some information in a joking voice. That's enough has gone, Dan. We had a long talk last night while the servants were out. I made her promise to stop preying on me. Of course, I had certain occult defenses I never told you about. She had to give in. I got frightfully angry. Just packed up and started for New York. Walked right out to catch the 8:20 into Boston. I suppose people will talk, but I can't help that. You needn't mention that there was any trouble, just say she's gone on a long research trip. It's probably going to stay with one of her horrible groups of devotees. Now she'll go west and get a divorce. Anyhow, I've made a promise to keep away and let me alone. It was horrible, that. She was stealing my body, crowding me out, making a prisoner of me. I laid low and pretended to let her do it. I had to be on the watch. I could plan if I was careful, for she can't read my mind literally, or in detail. All she could read was my planning, a sort of general mood of rebellion. She always thought I was helpless. Never thought I could get the best of her. But I had a spell or two that worked. Darby looked over his shoulder and took some more of the whiskey. Paid off those damned servants this morning when they got back. They were ugly about it, asked questions, but they went. They're her kind, Innsmouth people. Were hand in glove with her. I hope they'll let me go. I didn't like the way they laughed when they walked away. I must get as many of Dad's old servants again as I can. I'll move back home now. I suppose you think I'm crazy, Dan, but Arkham history ought to hint at things that back up what I've told you. I'm going to tell you. You've seen one of the changes, too. In your car, after I told you about Asenath that day coming home from Maine. That was when she got me. Drove me out of my body. The last thing, the right I remember, was when I was all worked up trying to tell you what that she-devil is. Then she got me, and in a flash I was back at the house. In the library, where those damned servants had me locked up. And in that cursed fiend's body that isn't even human. No, it was she who must have ridden home with that praying wolf in my body. You ought to have known the difference. I shuddered as Darby paused. Surely I had known the difference, yet could I accept an explanation as insane as this? But my distracted caller was growing even wilder. I had to save myself. I had to, Dan. You'd have got me for good at Hallows. They hold a Sabbath up there beyond Chestnut. Sacrifice with clenched things. You'd have got me for good. She'd have been I'd have been. She forever. My body have been hers for good. You'd have been a man, fully human, just as she wanted to be. Suppose she'd have put me out of the way, built her own ex-body of me in it, just as she did before, just as it did before. Edward's face was now atrociously distorted. He bedded uncomfortably close to mine as his voice fell to a whisper. You must know what I hinted in the car. That she isn't Asenath at all. The really old Ephraim himself. I suspected it a year and a half ago, but I know it now. Her handwriting shows it when she's off guard. Sometimes she dots down a note in writing that's just like her father's manuscripts. Stroke. Or stroke. Sometimes she says things that nobody but an old man like Ephraim could say. He changed forms with her when he felt death coming. She was the only one he could find with the right kind of brain and weak enough will. He got her body permanently, just as he almost got mine, and then poisoned the old body he put her into. Haven't you seen old Ephraim's soul glaring out of that she-devil's eyes dozens of times? It was mine when she had control of my body. The whisperer was panting and lost her breath. He said nothing, and when he resumed, his voice was near normal. This, I reflected, was the case for asylum. but I would not be the one to send him there. Perhaps time and freedom from Asanaf would do its work. I could see that he would never wish to dabble in morbid occultism as yet. I'll tell you more later. Must have a long rest now. I'll tell you something of the forbidden horrors she led me into. Something of the age-old horrors that even now are festering in out-of-the-way corners of a few monstrous priests to keep them alive. Some people know things about the universe nobody ought to know. I can do things that nobody ought to be able to do. Been in it up to my neck, and that's the end. Today I'd burn that damned Necronomicon and all the rest if I were a librarian of Miskatonic. But you can't get me now. I must get out of that accursed house as soon as I can and settle down at home. You'll help me, I know, if I need help. You're stylish servants, you know. People should get too inquisitive about us now. You see, I can't give them our address. There are certain groups of searchers, certain cults, you know. They might misunderstand our breaking up. Some of them have damnably curious ideas and methods. I know you'll stand by me if anything happens. Even if I have to tell you a lot that'll shock you. I had Edward stay and sleep in one of the guest chambers that night, and in the morning he seemed calmer. We discussed certain possible arrangements for his moving back into the Derby mansion. I hoped he would lose no time to making the change. He did not call me the next evening, but I saw him frequently during the ensuing weeks. We talked as little as possible about strange and unpleasant things, but discussed the renovation of the old Derby house, and the travels which Edward promised to take with my son and me the following summer. Of Asanov we said almost nothing, for I saw that the subject was a peculiarly disturbing one. Gossip, of course, was rife, but that was no novelty in connection with the strange menage at the old Crowningshield house. One thing I did not like was what Derby's banker let fall in an over-expansive mood at a Miskatonic club. About the checks Edward was sending regularly to a Moses and Abigail Sargent, and a Eunice Babson in Ismouth. That looked as if those evil-faced servants were extorting some kind of tribute from him, yet he had not mentioned that matter to me. I wished that the summer and my son's Harvard vacation would come, so we could get Edward to Europe. He was not, I soon saw, mending as rapidly as I hoped he would, for there was something a bit hysterical in his occasional exhilaration, while his moods of fright and depression were altogether too frequent. The old Derby house was ready by December, yet Edward constantly put off moving. Though he hated and seemed to fear the Crowningshield place, he was at the same time queerly enslaved by it. He could not seem to begin dismantling things, and invented every kind of excuse to postpone action. But I pointed this out to him, and he appeared unaccountably frightened. His father's old butler, who was there with other required family servants, told me one day that Edward's occasional prowlings about the house, especially down cellar, looking odd and unwholesome to him. I wondered if Asenath had been writing disturbing letters. The butler said there was no mail which could have come from her. This one I have a second bottle of water, sir. Need to step away to get another drink, as my water bottle is empty, and I don't see what I may have done with the second one, if I had one. So I will go and get myself some more tea. More than that, I also need to use the restroom. Now, I usually don't run ads. I have the pre-stream ads, what you just see when you're first coming in, and that's that. But I do run ads whenever there is a long break without content, or I need to use the restroom. So I will run a 3-minute ad, and then we will be back. Let me go ahead and start the music and pause the atmosphere. And we will be back in a few.
No, not rename properties.
Alright, sorry for waiting. I'm back. In just a moment. And we'll get right back to things. Test 1, 2, real quick from my mic. There we go. Mic is proper, around 25 to 20 decibels, or however it's measured. I don't know why it shows in negative decibels. It confuses me slightly. But I've got some more tea, a new unopened bottle of water, and we resume after I blow my nose. Chapter 6. Hold on a moment. I guess you could also pet level, guys. I did that by sheer accident. This is necessary. I guarantee this is necessary. It was about Christmas that Derby broke down one evening while calling out to me. I was steering the conversation toward next summer's travels when he suddenly shrieked and leapt up from his chair with a look of shocking, uncontrollable fright. A cosmic panic and loathing such as only the nether gulfs of nightmare could bring to any sane mind. And isn't this music total whiplash? The horrors of Christmas. My brain, God, it's tugging from beyond, knocking along that she-devil even now. From, come on, the pit of the Shoggoths, yeah, Shepnagorath, the goat for 1,000 young. The flame, beyond the body, beyond life, and the earth. Oh, God! I pulled him back to his chair, poured some wine down his throat as his frenzy sank to a dull apathy. He did not resist, but kept his lips moving as if talking to himself. Presently I realized that he was trying to talk to me. I bent my ear to his mouth to catch the feeble words. Again? Let's try. I don't know. Nothing can stop that force. Not distance. Not magic. Not death. It comes. Mostly in the night. I can't leave. It's horrible. What did you do? It's how horrible it is. While he had slumped down into a stupor, I propped him with pillows and let normal sleep overtake him. I did not call a doctor, for I knew what would be said of his sanity, and I wished to give nature a chance if I possibly could. He waked at midnight, and I put him to bed upstairs, but he was gone by morning. He had let himself quietly out of the house, and his butler, when called on the wire, said he was at home pacing restlessly about the library. Edward went to pieces rapidly after that. He did not call again, but I went daily to see him. He would always be sitting in his library, staring at nothing and having an air of abnormal listening. Sometimes he talked rationally, always on trivial topics. Any mentions of his trouble, of future plans, or of not sent him into a frenzy. His butler said he had frightful seizures a night, during which he might eventually do himself harm. At a long talk with his doctor, banker, and lawyer, finally took the physician with 2 specialist colleagues to visit him. The spasms that resulted from the first questions were violent and pitiable. And that evening, a closed car took his poor, struggling body to the Arkham Sanitarium. I was made his guardian, called on him twice weekly. almost weeping to hear his wild shrieks. Awesome whispers, dreadful droning repetitions of such phrases as, "We had to do it. We had to do it. It'll get me. It'll get me. Down there. Down there in the dark. Mother. Mother. Leave me. Leave me." How much hope of recovery there was, no one could say. I tried my best to be optimistic. Edward must have a home if he emerged, so I transferred his servants to the Derby mansion. It would surely be his sane choice. What to do about the crowning shield place with its complex arrangements and collection of utterly inexplicable objects, I could not decide, so I left it momentarily untouched, telling the Derby horsemaid to go over and dust the chief rooms once a week, ordering the furnace man to have a fire on those days. The final nightmare came before Candlemas, heralded in cruel irony by a false gleam of hope. One morning late in January, the sanitarium telephoned to report that Edward's reason had suddenly come back. His continuous memory, they said, was badly impaired, but sanity itself was certain. Of course, he must remain some time for observation, but there could be little doubt of the outcome. All going well, he would surely be free in a week. He hastened over in a flood of delight, but stood bewildered when a nurse took me to Edward's room. The patient rose to greet me, extending his hand with a polite smile, but I saw in an instant that he bore a strangely energized personality that seemed so foreign as his own nature. The competent personality I had found so vaguely horrible, in which Edward himself once vowed was the intruding soul of his life. There was the same blazing vision, so like Asimov's and old Ephraim's, and the same firm mouth, the deep irony, so redolent of potential evil. This was the person who had driven my car through the night 5 months before. The person I had not seen since that brief call, when he had forgotten the old-time doorbell signal and stirred such nebulous fears in me. Now he filled me with the same dim feeling of blasphemous alienage and ineffable cosmic fierceness. He spoke affably of arrangements for release. There was nothing for me to do but assent, despite some remarkable gaps in his recent memories. But I felt something was terribly, inexplicably wrong and abnormal. There were horrors in this thing I could not reach. This was a sane person. But was it indeed the Edward Derby I had known? If not, who or what was it? And where was Edward? Ought it to be free or confined, or ought it to be extirpated from the face of the earth? There was a hint of the abysmally sardonic in everything the creature said. The Asenath-like eyes left a special and baffling mockery to certain words about the early liberty earned by an especially close confinement. Must behave very awkwardly, and was glad to beat a bird trait. All that day and the next I racked my brain over the problem. What had happened? What sort of mind looked out through those alien eyes in Edward's face? I could think of nothing but this dimly terrible enigma, and gave up all efforts to perform my usual work. The second morning, the hospital called up to say that the recovered patient was unchanged, and by evening I was close to a nervous collapse. A state I admit, though others will allow it colored my subsequent vision. I have nothing to say on this point, except that no madness of mine could account for all the evidence. Chapter 7. It was in the night, after that second evening, that stark, utter horror burst over me, and weighted my spirit with a black, clutching panic from which it can never shake free. It began with a telephone call just after midnight. I was the only one up and sleepily took down the receiver in the library. No one seemed to be on the wire, and I was about to hang up and go to bed when my ear caught a very faint suspicion of sound at the other end. Was someone trying under great difficulty to talk? As I listened, I thought I heard a sort of liquid bubbling noise. Which had an odd suggestion of inarticulate, unintelligible word and syllable divisions. I called, "Who is it?" But the only answer was, I could only assume that the noise was mechanical, but fancying that it might be a case of broken instrument, able to receive but not to send, I added, "I can't hear you. Better hang up and try information." Immediately I heard the receiver go on the hook at the other end. This, I say, was just before midnight, but when that call was traced afterward, it was found to have come from the old Crowningshield house, though it was fully half a week from the housemaid's day to be there. I shall only hint what was to be found at that house. The upheaval in a remote cellar storeroom, the tracks, the dirt, the hastily rifled wardrobe, the bang marks on the telephone, the clumsily used stationery, and the little stench lingering over everything. The police, poor fools, have their smug little theories. They're still searching for those sinister discharged servants, who dropped out of sight amidst the present foreknown. They speak of a ghoulish revenge for things that were done, and say I was included because I was Edward's best friend and advisor. Idiots. Do they fancy those brutish clowns could have forged that handwriting? Did they fancy that they could have brought what later came? Are they blind to the changes in that body that was Edward's? As for me, I now believe all that Edward Derby ever told me. There are horrors beyond life's edge that we do not suspect. And once in a while, man's evil prying calls them just within our range. Ephraim, that's enough. The devil called them in. They engulfed Edward, just as they are engulfing me. Can I be sure that I'm safe? Those powers survived the life of the physical form. The next day in the afternoon, when I pulled out of my prostration and was able to walk and talk coherently, I went to the madhouse and shot him dead, for Edward's and the world's sake. But can I be sure till he's cremated? They're keeping the body for some silly autopsies by different doctors, but I say he must be cremated. He must be cremated. He who was not Edward Derby when I shot him. I shall go mad if he's not, for I may be the next. But my will is not weak, and I shall not let it be undermined by the tears I know are seething around it. One life, Ephraim, Asenath, and Edward. Who now? I will not be driven out of my own body. I will not change souls with that bullet ridden lich in the madhouse. But let me try to tell coherently of that final horror. I will not speak of what the police persistently ignore. The tales of that dwarfed, grotesque, malodorous thing met by at least 3 wayfarers in High Street just before 2 o'clock, and the nature of the single footprints in certain places. I will only say just about 2 of the doorbell and knocker walked me. Doorbell and knocker both applied alternatively, and uncertainly, in a kind of weak desperation, and each trying to keep to Edward's old signal of 3 and 2 strokes. Roused from sound sleep, my mind leapt into turmoil. Darby at the door, remembering the old code. New personality had not remembered it. Was Edward suddenly back in his rightful state? Why was he here in such evident stress and haste? Had he been released ahead of time, or had he escaped? Perhaps, I thought as I flung on a robe and bounded downstairs, his return to his own self had brought raving and violence, provoking his discharge and driving him into a desperate dash for freedom. Whatever had happened, he was good old Edward again, and I would help him. I opened the door into the elm-arched blackness. An insufferable fetid wind almost flung me prostrate. I choked in nausea, and for a second scarcely saw the dwarf-topped figure on the steps. The summons had been Edward's, but who was this foul, stunted parody? Where had Edward had time to go? His ring had only sounded only second before the door opened. The caller had on one of Edward's overcoats. Its bottom almost touching the ground. Its sleeves rolled back, yet still covering its hands. On the head was a slouch hat pulled low, while a black silk muffler concealed the face. As I stepped unsteadily forward, the figure made a semi-liquid sound, like that I had heard over the telephone. It thrusted me a large, closely written paper, impaled on the end of a long pencil. Still reeling from the morbid and unaccountable fetter, I seized this paper and tried to read it in the light of the doorway. Beyond question, it was in Edward's script. But why had he written when he was close enough to ring? And why was the script so awkward, coarse, and shaky? I could make out nothing in the dim half-light, so I edged back into the hall, the dwarf figure clumping mechanically after, but pausing in the inner door's threshold. The odor of this singular message was really appalling, and I hoped, but in vain, thank God, that my wife would not wake and confront it. Then, as I read the paper, I felt my knees give under me, and my vision go back. I was lying on the floor when I came to, and a cursed sheet still clutched in my fear-ridged hand. This is what it said. Dan, go to the sanitarium and kill it. Exterminate it. It isn't Edward Derby anymore. She's got me. It's Asnaf, and she has been dead 3 months and a half. I lied when I said she had gone away. I killed her. I had to. It was sudden, but we were alone, and I was in my right body. I saw Candlestick, smashed her head in. Should have got me for good at hot mass. I buried her in the farther cellar storeroom under some old boxes and cleaned up all the traces. The servants suspected next morning, but they have such secrets that they dare not tell the police. I set them off, but God knows what they and others at the cult will do. I thought for a while I was all right, and then I felt it tugging at my brain. I knew what it was. I ought to have remembered. A soul like hers or Ephraim's is half detached and keeps right on after death as long as the body lasts. He was getting me, making me change bodies with her, seizing my body and putting me in that corpse of hers buried in the cellar. I knew what was coming. That's why I snapped and had to go to the asylum. Then it came. I found myself choked in the dark. An Asnaf's rotting carcass down there in the cellar, and it walks as where I put it. And I knew she must be in my body at a sanitarium. Permanently. But it was after Hallowmass, and the sacrifice would work even without her being there. Sane and ready for release as a menace to the world. I was desperate, and in spite of everything, I clawed my way out. Too far gone to talk. I couldn't manage to telephone, but I can still write. We could fix up somehow and bring you this last word in warning. Kill that fiend if you value the peace and comfort of the world. See that it is cremated. If you don't, it will live on and on, body to body, forever. I can't tell you what it'll do. Keep clear of black magic, Dan. It's the devil's business. Goodbye. Been a great friend. Tell the police whatever the hell believe. I'm damnably sorry to drag you all this into you. I'll be at peace before long. This thing won't hold together much more. I hope you can read this. and kill that thing. Kill it. Yours. It. It was only afterward that I read the last half of this paper, for I had fainted at the end of the third paragraph. I fainted again when I saw and smelled what cluttered up the threshold where the warm air had stuck it. The messenger would not move, or have consciousness anymore. The butler, tougher fibre than I, did not faint at when I met him in the hall in the morning. Instead, he telephoned the police. When they came, I had been taken upstairs to bed. But the other mass, they were had collapsed in the night. The men put handkerchiefs to their noses. What they finally found inside Edward's oddly assorted clothes was mostly liquescent horror. There were bones, too, and a crushed-in skeleton. Some dental work, positively a diet. Some dental work possibly identified the skull as Athamas. Was the thing at the doorstep. The second and final tale for tonight. I think it's been a good, decent stream, and that was a good long story. See me? I plan to bounce around between author to author, but I need to find my other books. Worst case scenario, most of these are in the public domain. I kind of wish to read something about the King in Yellow, but I'm not entirely sure. I'd have to go out my way to find them. I have a book for Edgar Allan Poe somewhere around here, but I have no idea where it's gotten to. I'm going to, again, try to keep to the 2-hour mark. I will stream tomorrow as well as the day after. So there will be 4 total streams this week. There's tonight's stream. There's... Look, when I say Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday stream, it's more of a Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday stream, just because I used to start these at midnight, then I start them at 1 a.m., and obviously I'm coming at these from one direction. So I started a pre-stream at 11:50, then it started properly at midnight. And it's still technically Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday for some people, like in California, since they're 2 hours behind. This was a Monday stream, there will be another Tuesday stream, then a Wednesday stream, then I've got a Halloween stream planned for, well, Halloween. I don't know when I'll start. I don't yet know what I'll do, but there will be a Halloween stream. And for Tuesday and Wednesday, I shall be reading, hopefully at least 2 hours worth of horror stories, just like tonight. Also, while we're still figuring out the time, we have figured out a plan for the 24-hour charity stream, which will be on the 8th. For those not familiar with it, Extra Life is a charity dedicated to a certain network of children's hospitals. Every year they have a few events. Each of them are 24 hours long. Technically speaking, it's just that the events run the whole day. But there are people like myself who do an entire 24-hour stream dedicated for that charity. I've been doing those year after year, and this year will be no different. This year, we're going to be running some randomizers in cooperation with each other. We're still hammering out the specific games, and we need to do some testing, but we'll be using Archipelago. That will be sometime on November 8th, on a Saturday. Like I said, we're still figuring out the exact times. I hope to have Lily, Gray, and my brother involved, but keep an ear to the ground and watch the Twitter, and I'll let everyone know. Beyond that, I do thank everyone who popped in for the stream. We had Tsubaki popping in earlier. They gave a follow before having to head to bed. There was Pig Catapult. Thanks for popping in for the first time. Hopefully you enjoyed what you see and hear. You're free to peruse the VODs, and hopefully you give a follow. And hopefully we might see you the next few nights. The offer for the tarot readings will at least last until the end of the month. I don't know whether or not I'll keep that in the future, but it seems very seasonal. Oh, there it is. Thank you very much for the follow, Big Cannibal. Hopefully the rest of your evening and or morning, depending on your time zone, go well. And be sure to finish that water at some point. Heaven knows my throat is killing me. But yeah, with all that out of the way, good night, everybody. And see y'all tomorrow. Or not. You might be watching this VOD on YouTube. Who knows? Bye-bye.